Hello and welcome to the Week 10 lecture in the Law and Bioethics course on research ethics and the law. In the next half hour, I intend to address three topics. First, we'll discuss two parallel ethical crises in contemporary research. Second, we'll review the legal structures developed in the 1970s and 1980s to address unethical research concerns. And finally, we'll review a handful of ethical issues that the law has failed sufficiently to address up to now. I'd like to begin with two stories from my own field, that of mental health. One about Bruno Bettelheim and the other about David Rosenhan. And it's worth noting that Bettelheim and Rosenhan were probably the two most influential and two most well-known mental health professionals of the second half of the 20th century. Bruno Bettelheim had a very distinguished pedigree. He had studied under Freud in Vienna, where he'd been a member of the Viennese Psychoanalytic Society. He had raised autistic children in his own home. He'd earned 2 PhDs, one in psychology and one in art history, became a very proficient psychoanalyst, and then took up a position at the University of Chicago after the war. He was actually a Jewish Holocaust survivor, or had been imprisoned in a concentration camp before the war, and then fled to the United States in 1939. Bettelheim gained fame in the 1950s and 1960s for pioneering work on autism. There was a researcher, Leo Kanner, who had noticed that the parents of autistic children were themselves somewhat detached, and he attributed this to genetics, that neuroatypical parents would have neuroatypical children. But Bettelheim, heavily influenced by Freudian psychiatry, attributed this to an environmental force, and he explained autism as the result of refrigerator mothers. And he treated it with what was called a parentectomy, taking children away from these mothers and away from their families and raising them in orthogenic treatment homes. And about 10,000 children were treated in these homes from the 1950s through the 1980s. His thinking also led to new theories about how to treat schizophrenia in its origins. The idea that a schizophrenogenic mother, a mother who was hot and cold invariably, led to a schizophrenic child, while a purely cold mother, a detached mother, led to an autistic child. I should add there's no scientific basis for this today at all. This has been entirely discredited, largely through the work of Stella Chess, who wrote a dramatic paper in the early 1980s called the Blame the Mother ideology, in which he said that male researchers were blaming mothers without any scientific basis. The reason I mention this case is that a newspaper reporter named Richard Pollock, whose brother had actually been treated in one of these homes and later died in an accident, decided he was going to investigate his brother's experiences. And he wrote this best-selling book, The Creation of Dr. B, in which he explored in some detail Bruno Bettelheim's origins. And Bruno Bettelheim, by this time, was a household name. He had written a book about the Freudian interpretation of fairy tales that won numerous awards. He was a figure on radio and television, and certainly the most well-known mental health professional or psychologist in the country. Pollock discovered that Bettelheim had likely never earned a PhD. He had never known Freud, had never been a member of the Psychoanalytic Society of Vienna. He had never raised an autistic child. His wife had raised a troubled child who was probably not autistic. He had no appropriate training for the role he played. And in essence, he was just a Austrian Jewish man with an accent and a beard who had fooled the American people and the psychiatric field for nearly 30 years. In the era before the internet, it was very hard to verify the credentials of some researchers, particularly those who were trained in Europe before World War II, or whose records had been destroyed during the disruptions of the war and then the subsequent Cold War. But his exposure in the early 1980s and his eventual suicide revealed the first of a number of cases in which well-known researchers had engaged in fraud, and their actual theories were largely the product of fraudulent conduct. And we now know that Bettelheim, among other things, likely used corporal punishment excessively in his facilities, and that sexual violence was rampant in these facilities, and largely went unchecked and unpunished. The second individual I want to tell you about is David Rosenhan. David Rosenhan was also a psychologist. He actually was a psychologist with a real PhD, who worked at Stanford in the 1960s and 1970s. And he was most famous for the Rosenhan experiment, which was at the time the most important experiment ever done in psychology. What he did was he was concerned that psychiatric patients were being misdiagnosed in mental health facilities. So he asked a number of his graduate students to pretend to be mentally ill, and he sent them to a number of psychiatric hospitals around the country saying that they were hearing the words empty, hollow, or thud repeated over and over again in their heads. The minute they were admitted, they immediately said the symptoms had gone away, and yet their average length of stay was 19 days, with a range of 7 days to 52 days, even though they were asymptomatic. It turned out the staff couldn't identify that they were faking, but other patients often could. All but one was diagnosed with schizophrenia in remission. One was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in remission. Then Rosenhan, who faced challenges from hospitals that said that he could fool some of the people some of the time, but couldn't fool major teaching hospitals, repeated the study in which he, after screening for malingerers, sent fake patients to a number of hospitals. And of the 193 patients he sent there, the hospitals claimed they found 41 imposters and 43 suspects. Only it later turned out he hadn't sent them anyone, that these were real patients they were missing and assuming to be malingerers. This study led to a paper on being sane in insane places that transformed psychiatry in two very distinct ways. One, it led to the redesign of the DSM and the radical shift of the DSM from a psychodynamic document toward a symptom-based document. And two, it accelerated deinstitutionalization in the 1980s. You may recall that John F. Kennedy created legislation that led to the release of hundreds of thousands of patients from psychiatric hospitals across the country in the 70s and 80s. But it was Ronald Reagan who used the Rosenhan experiment's data to claim that psychiatric hospitals weren't curing or treating people, and that psychiatrists, in essence, didn't know what they were doing, and therefore the taxpayer should save money by not funding psychiatric admissions. And the result of which, my own personal bias, is why we see so many mentally ill homeless on the streets today, all based on the seminal experiment by David Rosenhan. 3 years ago, Susanna Cahalan, a New York Post reporter who is best known for her best-selling book, Braying on Fire, about her own experiences with AMBI receptor encephalitis, decided she wanted to interview the graduate students who had taken part in this study to find out how this experience had influenced them and how it had changed their lives. And she set about tracking them down and interviewing them. And she couldn't find them. And the reason she couldn't find them, as discussed in her best-selling book, The Great Pretender, was the odds were overwhelming that most of them didn't exist. That Rosenhan didn't do a study, that he sat in his office and made up the data. That the most important, influential study in modern social psychology that has transformed the psychiatric field likely never took place. Data is increasingly revealing that this phenomenon is widespread, and I will offer you two very concrete examples. Dietrich Stoppel was one of the most well-known social psychologists of the first decades of the 21st century. He was a Dutch psychologist. His two most famous papers are the one demonstrating that people who eat meat are more likely to be violent or cruel than people who are vegetarians, and that if you beautify railroad stations or public places, people are less likely to be xenophobic or racist than if there's litter or pollution. He published 58 major papers, all of which have since been retracted, because it turned out that Dr. Stoppel never left his office. He simply came up with an interesting idea for a study that was plausible, then claimed he'd done it, made up data to back up his claim, and published it. Hans Eysenck, who is one of the fathers of modern personality psychology and particularly known for associating psychological phenomena and personalities with illness. So there was a cancer-prone personality or a heart disease-prone personality. And this was very convincing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, until more recently, after his death, somebody went back and tried to do the math to confirm his data, because his data was striking that your odds of death from heart disease or cancer rose radically based on personality test results. And turned out that the effect sizes The number of patients or subjects he would have needed to produce the data he had were impossible. He would have needed for him to study tens of millions of people to get the effect sizes that he discovered, which obviously he could not have done. All of this is part of a larger replicability crisis in mental health and psychology and psychiatry. And Brian Nozick is one of the driving forces behind this. He was a professor in Virginia who tried to replicate the leading studies, the 100 most prominent studies in social psychology in the year 2008, and found that the majority of them could not be replicated. How many of them were fraudulent versus how many of them simply were the product of noise or bad research or other mistakes is unclear. But it has become clear over time that many of the most well-known studies in psychology and psychiatry, studies like the Stanford Prison Experiment and the Milgram Experiment, were at best doctored to get results that were probably atypical of what might be gathered today, and in some cases were outright fraudulent. Increasingly, researchers have all started to look at medical studies and come up with, although not numbers that are as alarming, more and more studies that appear to be fraudulent. And I think the most well-known of them all is the Andrew Wakefield study on autism and the MMR vaccine, which has since been discredited, but not before millions of people concluded that autism was a result of vaccination. I began with the replicability crisis, which is occurring in medicine and particularly in research, because it is one of the two major ethical challenges in research today, and it's the one the law has largely failed to grapple with. I'm now going to turn to the other crisis, the one about unethical research, which the law has largely sought to grapple with, although the degree to which it has done it is unclear. And before I get there, I want to give you a brief history, and a brief one, of some unethical research, just so you get a sense of what the regulators in the 1970s and 80s were doing and the backdrop they were working against. And I always like to start with J. Marion Sims because he is the father of gynecology. But much of his research was performed, as some of you may know, on Black female slaves in the antebellum South without anesthesia, including 30 procedures on one subject, some of whose names are known, some of whose names are not known. His statue, and that is a picture of it, stood in front of my medical school when I was a medical student, and then my hospital when I was a resident, and was removed several years ago at the behest of the city. But because of a particularly charged racial nature of Simmons's work, his research has drawn maybe its fair share, but certainly a substantial share of attention. Other forms of unethical, or what today we would view as unethical research, have gone largely ignored by history. So one famous example is Arthur Wentworth, who demonstrated the safety of lumbar punctures, LPs, spinal taps by performing these procedures on 29 children at the turn of the 20th century in Boston Children's Hospital without informing the children or their parents what he was doing or getting permission. These were in no way therapeutic. They were simply research to see if the procedure worked. That is Leo Stanley. Leo Stanley was the San Quentin prison surgeon in California from 1913 to 1951. He's also a well-known eugenicist. His major contribution to prisons was he decided to segregate the prisons San Quentin because he was concerned that people of Black, white, Native American races were intermingling in the cell blocks. I can make a fairly compelling case that he may have been among the worst human beings ever to live, but that is a subjective opinion. I can tell you what he did. He was a big believer in glandular rejuvenation, that if you could take animal testicles and transplant them into other people, you could cure diseases, generate energy, treat mental illness, and the like. He actually preferred human testicles, but he didn't have that many of them. So how did he go about finding them? He used, without consent, the testicles of executed inmates and actually paid their spouses on some occasions to use the glands in order to implant them in other prisoners, again, without the other prisoners' permissions, to see the consequences of experimentation. The estimates are he did 10,000 such procedures, all non-consensual, during his time at San Quentin. You all probably know Jonas Salk for his pioneering work that transformed the world by developing a polio vaccine in the 1950s. But before that, he participated in an experiment at a psychiatric facility in Michigan where they sprayed live influenza into the nasal passages of psychiatric patients to test both its natural course and potential treatments. During World War II, to test the efficacy of malaria treatments and potential vaccines, Prisoners at Statesville Penitentiary in Illinois were offered an opportunity for better conditions and potential early release to take part in experiments where they were exposed to malaria and malaria treatments. Among these prisoners, by the way, was Nathan Leopold of the famous murder duo of Leopold and Loeb. I imagine by now, being bioethicists, you are all familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis studies, which studied the natural course of syphilis in African American men in Alabama long after syphilis was treatable. You're probably less familiar with the Guatemala study, though some of you may be. This was not a natural course of illness study. This was a treatment study where they intentionally infected low-income individuals and prostitutes with syphilis and then studied its course. And at least 83 deaths were attributable to this. Although the study was conducted primarily by Guatemalan officials, it was authorized and supervised by the U.S. Public Health Service. But by far, from my perspective, the most outrageous experiment in modern U.S. history is known as the Krugman-McCollum hepatitis experiment. And Robert McCollum was a prominent physician at Yale and Saul Krugman at NYU. One of them went on to be dean of the Dartmouth Medical School. And at the State School for the Cognitively Impaired, Willowbrook on Staten Island, they wanted to study the natural course of viral hepatitis, particularly hepatitis A. So they made milkshakes out of human feces and fed them to the young children without consent from the children or their parents. And the children thought they were having chocolate milkshakes, but they were actually having human feces-infected milkshakes with hepatitis. And then followed the natural course of the illness from 1958 to 1964. They published their data in major medical journals and were lauded by the scientific community for their pioneering research in the field. I had hoped to assign as supplemental reading parts of Harriet Washington's amazing book, Medical Apartheid, for this course, but there were copyright issues, and I admire and respect Harriet and didn't want to steal her copyrighted material. But I urge you to consider reading that brilliant book. That being said, among the things she documents are the efforts of MK-Ultra, which was a CIA endeavor in the 50s and 60s, led by a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb, that tried to brainwash people through using LSD, toxic chemicals, and electric shocks, engaged in sensory deprivation studies, as well as other bizarre experiments, like releasing pathogens into the water supply at the Food and Drug Administration building in Washington to study the natural course of this supposedly non-dangerous pathogen, or intentionally starting a whooping cough epidemic in a low-income African-American neighborhood in Tampa to study what might happen if the Soviets engaged in biological warfare. It was the revelation of both the Tuskegee syphilis study in 1972, largely through the work of Peter Buxton, and then the revelation of the MK-Ultra program, which was highly illegal in 1975, that led the Senate under Senator Frank Church of Idaho to investigate and propose regulation of research in the United States. And the Church Committee, and later a committee headed by Senator Edward Kennedy, led to the adoption of the National Research Act, which in 1974 set the baseline for regulation of research going forward. It created the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, which has been replaced by the Office for the Protection of Human Subjects. And it had four goals: to define the boundaries of what was research and what was medical practice, to assess the risks and benefits of different types of human subject research, to create guidelines for when and how to choose human subjects, and to define a baseline standard for the meaning of informed consent. The National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects in Biomedical and Behavioral Research's most important contribution was that of the Belmont Commission, a panel of experts that produced a report known as the Belmont Report that was published in 1978 and finally adopted into federal law in 1979. And it stated the three principles of medical research that we now take for granted: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, particularly related to underrepresented populations. It's important to note these are parallel to the four principles of bioethics that you may know from Beauchamp and Childress. They are similar, but although there's overlap, they are distinct phenomena. The issues that the Commission had trouble grappling with were equipoise, making sure that both study arms in any study had an equal chance of success, that we weren't denying people efficacious treatment. But the challenge with that is that in some studies, if you have a fatal disease for which there is no treatment, the treatment arm by definition is better than the non-treatment arm because the non-treatment arm will lead to death. And assuming you view death as the worst outcome, you can't generate equipoise. I guess you could say that slow, painful, torturous death is worse than no death, but most people don't view it that way, and it's a very rare possibility. So creating equipoise is still a challenge. How to handle vulnerable populations, which I'll talk about more in a little while, remains a challenge. And finally, jurisdictional boundaries, because the Commission's report generally applied to research in the United States. And as we've seen, and you will see in some of the readings, how to do research in other nations proves challenging because often you're providing a higher standard of care than individuals in those nations would otherwise receive, but still a lower one that would be acceptable in the United States. And the most famous example of this is the study of ACT in Africa, an early HIV drug, and the question of whether or not individuals in Africa could be provided care that would not be acceptable in the United States, but was better than the treatment otherwise available to them in Africa, in order to test a short course versus a long course of the treatment, which would have been more cost effective. And the other question related to that is whether or not journals should publish data that occurs across jurisdictions or outside the United States that could not take place within the United States. And Marcia Angel, the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine at the time, eventually said the buck stopped with her and refused to print such journal articles in the future. One of the most challenging questions that now seems fairly obvious to us today, but was not at the time, is who exactly are human subjects? Because one of the results of the National Research Act was the creation of IRBs, institutional review boards, that govern research on human subjects. But is journalism research on human subjects? Is oral history research on human subjects? And the IRBs generally have said no, and the federal government, the Department of Health and Human Services, finally offered guidance a few years ago, saying journalism, oral history are clearly not human subject research. There are also exceptions for quality improvement if you're using your data for internal purposes rather than with the primary purpose of disseminating it. The challenge occurs when you start off doing a quality improvement study and then realize the data may be beneficial for publication and help others, and you seek to get IRB approval to disseminate it more widely. Because related to that is the underhanded method that you should not engage in, but people do, where they try to disguise research as quality improvement. So they get their data under the guise of quality improvement and then claim later on they've discovered there's a research value and seek to publish it. And finally, there's a question of surveying. And surveying prior to the 1970s, asking your friends, your classmates, the public for information, wasn't widely considered to be the subject of regulation for human subject research, but it is very clear now that surveys do constitute research. I always like to give a case example of Warren Harding. Warren Harding, as some of you may know, was president of the United States in the 1920s, and he allegedly fathered an illegitimate child. And his child published his best-selling book, The President's Daughter, in which he claimed that his mistress published this book, The President's Daughter, in which she claimed she'd had an affair and had a child. But nobody knew in the 1920s whether this was true or not. About 15 years ago, I became interested in this question and wanted to do DNA testing. And there were only two subjects in my study. One was a direct descendant of Warren Harding, and one was a direct descendant of the alleged illegitimate child. And I wanted to compare their DNA. Is this human subject research or is this historical research? The IRB at my institution felt this was human subject research and created a very complex protocol. And eventually, one of the participants backed out because they were willing to give DNA, but not in the context of a very complex protocol. So IRBs can be valuable to protect people, but at the margins, they can also stifle research. I will mention, by the way, that the data eventually revealed in a different study someone else did that Harding's child was actually his child, the illegitimate child. It was not a fraud. Institutional review boards, which are required for research done at any institution under federal purview or receiving federal funding, which in essence covers almost every major institution, certainly all universities and hospitals in the United States, are designed to protect human subjects. There are separate committees that govern research on animals. The requirements are fairly bare bones. They have to have at least 5 members, include individuals from academic disciplines relevant to the research being reviewed. Include someone from the community who's not affiliated with the institution. There should be diversity in terms of race, gender, and cultural background, and people should have the necessary experience to fairly evaluate the proposed research. There's a lot of questioning as to how diverse meaningfully IRBs are, both in terms of the backgrounds of the participants and the nature of experience of the community members. So, for example, a number of years ago, I was on an IRB, and the woman who sat next to me, she was a lovely person, was a community member. And one day I asked her what she had done before she had become a community member on IRB. And I discovered she was had been a member of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Now, obviously, she had expertise outside of medicine and a lot of wisdom, but she wasn't a typical member of your local community in New York City. Research rules attempt to prevent coercion, and in fact, IRBs are supposed to prevent people from being coerced into taking part in research. On the other hand, compensation is allowed for participation in research. And IRBs grapple with how much is enough, how much fairly or justly compensates people, and there's been a heated debate over whether research subjects should be paid a wage, and then how much is too much. Because obviously, if you give people enough money to take part in a study, they will take part in it, or many of them will, but it becomes coercive. On the other hand, going to work every day is also coercive. If I don't go to work, they don't send me a paycheck. It's just coercive in a benign way. How much risk should we make you assume in return for how much money remains an unsettled question under federal regulations. Another challenging question is the re-identification crisis. So many people have donated tissue samples over the last 50 years, actually more like the last 70 years now, for research on cancer and genetics. And they assume when they gave these tissue samples, for which their names and identification was removed, that they could never be identified with the tissue samples. However, it has been demonstrated that using the genetic material and websites like 23andMe and the phone book, researchers can re-identify these samples and reattach them to people if they so choose, which, if this data is publicly available, means that an independent party could figure out not just your risk of cancer, but your risk of other diseases, or whether or not you have false paternity, or other things that might greatly concern you, your risk of Alzheimer's disease, and then report it back to you against your will. Considerable evidence shows that while the line between subject and patient may be clear to the researcher, it's very often not clear to the subject. One question is who conducts the consent. When your doctor also consents you for a research study, you may not understand that he's not consenting you for a clinical intervention. And secondly, when you're asked to make a decision about a study at the time of clinical care, you may not understand that you're not engaged in clinical care. Paul Applebaum has done considerable work on the concept of the therapeutic misconception, and data suggests that subjects really don't understand the concept of equipoise. They assume that if they're being enrolled in the study, they will benefit, even when the stated purpose of the study in the consent and from the researcher is that it's not a for-benefit study, or that there's a chance that they will be placed in an arm that won't benefit from them. They won't benefit from. And finally, I want to talk about a few unresolved challenges in research. And these are not just ethical challenges, but particularly ethical challenges the law has failed to adequately address. Even though the Belmont Commission and federal law strive for equity in research, they have failed to address the paradox of race now being widely considered a sociological construct, meaning Ashkenazi Jews or Yupik natives in Alaska may have a common genetic heritage, but blacks and whites as groups, do not have distinctive genetic heritages. There are black Africans in the Sudan who have more in common with Ashkenazi Jews than with other black Africans living in the Sudan from different genetic lineages and communities. So race is clearly a sociological construct that is widely accepted. However, pharmaceutical companies continue to fund research on race as a biological construct, and Bidil is the most well-known example of that, a medication that they studied with the goal of showing that it was more effective in African Americans, so they can market it to African Americans. But what they're picking up is both signal and noise. If you study enough groups with some people of similar genetic background and some of different background and enough traits, you will eventually come up with some positives. But if you studied other random assorted traits that were not racial, whether people have attached earlobes or long versus short index fingers, you would also generate similar phenomena. Just nobody does that. The difference being long versus short eardrums do not have a historic, long versus short earlobes do not have a historically detrimental or troublesome history in the United States, while race and ethnicity often do, and biological assumptions about race are pernicious in a way that biological assumptions about index finger length or earlobe attachment are not. Another major challenge is even though researchers are supposed to strive for equity and enrollment and to engage their community meaningfully, often communities are not primarily English speaking. And yet the costs of translation, if the investigators only speak English, are substantial. And many of the instruments that are used in research are not validated in other languages. So how do you connect with a Spanish-speaking population or a Mandarin-speaking population in New York City if it costs you more and you have chosen other instruments that are not validated in Mandarin or Spanish? And more importantly, should IRBs require that you do so? Is it the researcher's prerogative to choose to what degree he engages with non-English speakers, or should the institution impose such a requirement upon them? And I can tell you that increasingly, in potentially for benefit studies, IRBs are imposing these requirements on researchers, particularly if they are funded by pharmaceutical companies or outside entities. Blanket pregnancy exclusions are also legal, but ethically very problematic, and this will probably change during the course of your careers. There probably will be legal action on the subject. Pregnant individuals are vulnerable populations, but the reason they were designated vulnerable populations was to protect them. What has actually happened is pharmaceutical companies are excluding pregnant individuals from research even when there is no reason to suspect there will be any damage to fetal life or put women in danger, because they're concerned that negative outcomes might affect the marketability of their product. At the extreme, there are compassionate use studies for life-saving medications which pregnant individuals have been excluded from, nominally under the premise of protecting fetal life. But if these individuals are going to die anyway, why you wouldn't authorize compassionate use makes no logical sense. Instead, the companies are highly concerned that if there's a negative impact on fetal life or some teratogenic evidence, it will affect the marketability or approvability of their product. And the ethical question then occurs whether hospitals and researchers should be allowed to engage in such compassionate use, because they will save some patients. But if they said no to pharmaceutical companies and push back, likely the backlash would lead to a change in policy. And finally, an area I'm particularly interested in are group harms. Group harms can occur in a number of ways. They can occur, for example, in a disorder like Machado-Joseph syndrome, which is a rarer neurodegenerative disorder for which there is no treatment, and the individual suffering from it are afraid that a test might be developed by a pharmaceutical company to see whether they're at risk of developing it. And they don't want this done because there's no treatment or cure. Not only will having the test unmask them, but it will unmask the risk of other members of their families or communities who may not want to know their risk or whether they're going to come down with the illness. So to what degree a community should have a right to veto the development of a particular genetic test is one example of how group harms may manifest. Another one is in particular ethnic or cultural insular communities where researchers engage in research that may stigmatize the community as a whole with consent from a small number of participants. So, for example, if you were to go to, and this is a real example, a Native American community of similar genetic ancestry, and you wanted to study quote unquote inbreeding or consanguinity among the population, and you got consent from a small number of subjects, and then published a paper based on that consent about consanguinity or inbreeding in that community, you would do inadvertent harm, or maybe even advertent harm, to other members of that community. To what degree should cultural communities have veto power over research that can have a significant impact on their community as a whole? And the American legal system has so far failed to even address, let alone adequately address, the concept of group harms. That is the end of the 10th lecture. I look forward to seeing all of you in the next Zoom session. Thank you so much.